Imagine for a second that the very core of who you are, your identity, your personality, your entire trajectory in life, isn't entirely yours. What if, literally from the moment you were born, an invisible, heavily overlapping web of power structures just started deciding who you get to be? Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking a really fascinating, deeply complex psychological text by June Chisholm and Beverly Green. We're going to explore the hidden architecture of society that profoundly shapes the lived experiences, the opportunities, and the psychological reality of women of color. Because look, we're not just going to look at systems of race, gender, class, and sexuality as natural facts of life. The source material argues that these are actually meticulously constructed categories, designed specifically to maintain control.
Okay, let's dive into this. Human beings differ from one another in, honestly, millions of ways, right? Some of us are left-handed, some of us have green eyes, some are tall, some are short. Yet, society completely ignores most of these variations. The text asks a really profound question. Why are some characteristics, like skin color or gender, given this intense, massive social importance, while others are just completely ignored? Which differences actually make a difference? And honestly, more importantly, who decides what those differences even mean? Because it's not the physical difference itself that matters. It's the societal meaning attached to it that creates the friction, the hierarchy, and the power imbalances we see every day.
To really ground this conceptually, the source material introduces us to Iris Jacob. She's an 18-year-old biracial woman who just beautifully captures the whole complexity of this topic. She points out that women of color hold multiple, simultaneous identities. They come from impoverished locales, but also from highly privileged backgrounds. They're disabled, lesbian, bisexual, immigrants, mothers. You literally cannot place them into a single, neat little box. Now, traditional Western psychology has very often tried to study women of color through just a single lens. But as this quote so powerfully illustrates, their lived experience is this intricate intersection of many different realities happening all at once. And understanding this is absolutely crucial because it completely reframes how we look at human identity. It's not a single label, it's a highly dynamic, layered experience. Section 1. The myth of fixed identity.
This brings us to our first major concept from the research. For centuries, the consensual reality of Western culture has basically been that categories like race and gender are biological destinies. But here's the thing. Modern genetic analysis shows there's actually greater genetic variation within a so-called racial group than there is across different ones. So if race isn't biological, what is it? Well, the authors explain it as a social construction. Differences alone have absolutely no inherent meaning. It's the social context that defines them in order to create hierarchies. A hegemonic society assigns meaning to gender and race to maintain order, basically dictating who gets power and who gets marginalized. We're essentially taught what is natural, and those who don't fit that exact mold are heavily penalized.
Section 2. The architecture of privilege. Let's move to and see how this builds, because if differences are constructed, well, someone has to be doing the constructing, right? In the United States, cultural distinctions exist within a very strict hierarchical stratification, and sitting right at the top is the dominant culture. According to the text, this is the group that owns and controls commerce, dictates media representation, and decides what is culturally valuable. But here is the most psychologically fascinating aspect of this control. The dominant culture normalizes its own traits. The characteristics of the privileged group become the invisible baseline for what is considered normal. Consequently, anyone who falls outside of that, like women of color, is almost automatically labeled as deviant, deficient, or defective.
So the crucial point here is how this system sustains itself without sparking a constant rebellion. And it does so through the myth of meritocracy. This is the pervasive, everywhere you look belief that society distributes opportunities fairly and that anyone who succeeds simply worked harder. Why does understanding this matter to you? Because it fundamentally shapes how we view success and failure in our everyday lives. As the researchers note, this myth is absolutely brilliant in its psychological control. It completely masks systemic privilege, disguising it as an earned reward, which protects the powerful. And conversely, it forces marginalized groups to internalize the blame for their own systemic barriers. So if a woman of color faces a closed door, the myth of meritocracy whispers that it's her own fault, completely hiding the invisible structures working against her. And over time, these structures have evolved. We've moved away from explicit, out-in-the-open exclusion into what the text calls symbolic racism. The authors share this stunning anecdote about law professor Patricia Williams. She is a woman of color, and she was buying a house. Her mortgage was smoothly approved over the phone, no problem. But when the bank finally received her paperwork and saw she had crossed out white and checked off the box for black, the bank suddenly stalled.
Now, they didn't mention race, they didn't have to. Instead, using these coded terms, they suddenly demanded more money and higher interest rates, citing economic risk and concerns over property values. This right here is exactly how modern structural exclusion operates. It's invisible, it's polite, but it is deeply, deeply restrictive. Section 3. Socialization and Sexism. Of course, we know it's not just race. This invisible web targets women from early childhood, way before they ever enter the housing market or the workforce. The media and toy industries brainwash kids incredibly early. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The authors use the example of Bratz dolls. Just look at the boy doll. He's designed with books and a backpack, sending this very clear message that he is smart and ambitious. The girl doll, however, features heavy makeup and scanty clothing. The text notes that this imposes what is termed the prostitute stereotype on young girls. It literally teaches them that their natural state is unacceptable and that they must view themselves as objects to be valued by others. This kind of early socialization just completely sets the stage for a lifetime of gender inequality. And as these girls grow up, they have to navigate two different forms of sexism. The first one, hostile sexism. That's the explicit devaluation, the aggression, the unequal treatment. But the text highlights something far more insidious, which is benevolent sexism. This is a chivalrous ideology that offers protection and affection to women, but only if they embrace conventional subordinate roles. It is incredibly dangerous precisely because it feels subjectively favorable. It actually encourages women to accept an inferior status in a patriarchal society under the warm, fuzzy guise of being cherished and protected. Section 4. The intersection of oppression. Now we reach the deepest layer of this explainer. What happens when these invisible systems of sexism directly collide with racism? Well, for women of color, these are not separate tracks. They are a unified, lived experience. The text introduces a really critical concept here called racism. This captures the complex, compounded prejudice that targets women of color based simultaneously on their intersecting race and gender. The authors quote writer Elena Featherston, who notes that women of color basically live in a daily theater of the absurd. They are constantly, exhaustingly trying to counter negative assumptions imposed from the outside, all while trying to maintain their authentic selves. They aren't just dealing with racism from white society and then sexism from men, they are dealing with a totally unique, deeply intertwined combination of both. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how race sexism manifests in highly specific, targeted ways. The text breaks down these socially constructed stereotypes. For African American women, it's the mammy, the sapphire, or the welfare recipient. For Native American women, the squaw or the exotified Hollywood princess. For Hispanic women, the submissive or the hot-tempered Carmen Miranda type. And for Asian women, the geisha or the paradoxically submissive martial arts warrior. As the researchers point out so clearly, these aren't just offensive caricatures, they are structural tools. Each set of stereotypes serves as a very specific justification for the social, economic, and sexual exploitation of the women who belong to that group. And the web just keeps growing thicker, because identity isn't just race and gender, it's a stacking of oppressions. You add socioeconomic classism, you add heterosexism, ableism, ageism. This is so crucial to grasp because when individuals have multiple identities, some of those identities might place them in privileged groups, sure, but others place them in disparaged ones. The text heavily stresses that each layer of disadvantage actually compounds the negative effects of the others, fundamentally altering a woman's psychological reality and her actual physical mobility in the world. So when we look at the intersection of sexism and classism specifically, we see the real-world economic fallout. The text refers to this as the feminization of poverty. Coined by sociologist Diana Pierce, this refers to the systemic economic structures that disproportionately trap women, particularly women of color. The rapid growth of female-headed families, a labor market that actively discriminates against women workers, and the massively heavy burden of unpaid domestic responsibilities like childcare, they all intersect. Poverty isn't just a lack of money, it's a structural trap. And society's general disdain for the poor just adds this incredibly heavy layer of hostility and shame onto an already massive burden. Section 5. The psychological toll. So, how does living inside this invisible web actually feel? We've looked at the societal structures, but the text dives deep into the devastating mental, emotional, and psychological impact left on women of color. Many report experiencing this profound, painful schism between their public and private selves.
In public spaces like work or school, the dominant culture fundamentally misperceives them. They might be highly visible in terms of tokenism, seen as the diversity hire or the so-called representative of their race, but they're completely invisible in terms of their actual influence or authentic identity. Because they're defined by their race and gender first, their private, true self basically has to be hidden, and that leads to severe emotional isolation.
The psychological literature defines this state as marginality. It is the deeply uncomfortable existence of living between two worlds. You're perceived and treated differently by the dominant culture. But then, as you achieve success as defined by that dominant culture, you might also start to feel set apart or alienated from your own minority group. This profound sense of marginality and invisibility lays the groundwork for distorted self-worth and internalized depression. When the external world is constantly distorting your identity, it is incredibly, almost impossibly difficult to maintain a healthy internal one. The emotional weight of all this structural disadvantage is honestly perfectly captured in the text by a lyric from Billie Holiday's jazz classic, God Bless the Child. She sang, "Them that's got shall have, them that's not shall lose." It beautifully and tragically underscores the cyclical, almost inescapable feeling of class oppression and structural disadvantage. The system is quite literally designed to reward those who already have the privileged traits while continually penalizing those who do not. Which really brings us right back to where we started. The experiences of women of color are not just footnotes in psychology, they are the absolute key to understanding the deep, messy complexities of human identity. We all exist within this hierarchical stratification, we all possess some mix of privileged and disadvantaged traits, so the question is no longer just who are you, but rather, if your identity is shaped by an invisible web of power, who decides which of your differences actually matter? And more importantly, now that you can see the web, what will you do about it? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with us. Keep questioning the structures around you.